Hi everyone and welcome to my channel, Carie Paintings. Today we are going to be doing this picture, which is a carry on from the last video where I used this photograph to do a sketch. So this week and the following week I will be building up a finished painting using the sketch and this photo. I've also used a couple of other photos. So this was the sketch I did in the last video. For the finished painting, I'm actually going to add a couple of things that weren't in the sketch or in the photograph. I'm going to add a boat just there, and I'm also going to add a grassy bank in the lower right hand corner. So that's the sketch. Now for the materials that I'm going to be using, I did show you my watercolour paper last week, and this is it again. So this is Archer's watercolour paper, and it's in a watercolour block. And I'll show you what that means later. It is 140 pounds in weight, or 300 grams per square metre. And it's size 31 by 41 centimetres or 12 by 16. Now showing you what it means by a block, it's glued on all four sides, so you don't have to stretch it. It makes it a hard surface to paint on, and there is a little slot at the top where you actually break it away when you finish your painting. So that's the paper. I'm also going to be using a piece of tracing paper, not to trace a photograph, but to actually sketch out my rough sketch on. Now for my paints, I am going to use tubes of watercolour. I use Winsor & Newton and Daler Rowney, and this is my palette that I squeeze the tubes out onto, and these are my brushes. I use a mixture of brushes. I prefer sable, but they are more expensive and they do wear out quicker. The big fat one there is a Kalinsky number 10. Now this one is a number 4 sable round by Daler Rowney. This one is a 0 round, and this one is a number 1 sable round, again by Daler Rowney, and this one is a number 6 sapphire by Daler Rowney, which is the nicest of their range. Now I'm also going to be using some different sorts of masking fluid. This is a masking pen by Pibeo, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, which is a very fine nib, so that's very good for making very fine lines. I've also used a Frisk masking fine liner, which again is good for making fine lines, an eraser and a pencil. So those are basically all my materials. So let's get started. To start with, I'm going to be drawing out my sketch ready to transfer it to the paper, and I drew this on tracing paper just because I can then move it around on the paper before I transfer it to the actual watercolor paper. You don't want to do a lot of drawing and erasing on your watercolor paper because it does tend to ruin the tooth of the grain. So I tried to draw it once. That doesn't always happen, and as you'll see, it doesn't happen in this one. But anyway, I'm going to make a start and see what happens. Having done a sketch from it, it is good because it means I've already drawn the picture once in my head and physically. So it should mean that my hands and brain kind of work together more and know what they're drawing. However, I did change it in this one, so you still make mistakes, but that's part of art, isn't it? It's not precision, it's not taking photos. This is art and it is different. I just really want to get the main details in and where things are going to go on the picture, and that's one of my main reasons for using tracing paper, is that you can move individual things around within your picture. You decide, or I decided in this one that I'd put the boats in the wrong place, so on the finished picture I could actually move them and I didn't have to redraw them again. So that is the great thing about using tracing paper for your sketching. And in this preliminary sketch, I try not to put too much detail. Once I have transferred this sketch to my paper, I will add a lot more detail so that I know which bits will have to be masked, and when I'm doing a wash, where I will have to stop the wash so that other pieces can show through. So I've drawn this, and now I am just going over the back so that I've got some graphite on the paper to transfer it onto my watercolour paper. Now I did put the horizon line I think too high, and I did in fact change it again and move it down. But this was the initial drawing onto my watercolour paper. I did find it wasn't coming out that well. I should have used a softer pencil to put the graphite on the back of the tracing paper, but as I was downstairs I was too lazy to come upstairs and get my soft pencil. So here I am putting more graphite on. And you see I've moved it across. I decided that it wasn't far enough across to the right. And that again is the beauty of drawing on a piece of tracing paper first, is that as you transfer it you can move things around. And for my very basic lines that I put on there, I was just adding a little bit more detail. I really want to get where the creek is and where those two boats. The two boats are the things that have quite a lot of detail in them. But I really just need the shape of the hull and where their masts will go on to my sketch, and then I will refine that on to my actual watercolour paper itself. Now I'm taping up. This is a very low tack tape, which is usually good, but for some reason it didn't stick to this paper, so in the end I had to replace it with some higher tack masking tape. But you put the masking tape around so that when you paint you have a really nice line when you take it off at the end. You'll see at the end it's the most fun bit is taking the masking tape off at the end, because it really reveals your picture. But I drew this all out, and as I say, I then decided that it was a little bit too high, so I erased it and did it again. But I didn't move everything, just some of the things. But that's the great thing about doing the tracing. So here I have moved it down. Now I'm going to just add more detail, and then I will put in some masking fluid to mask out the bits that are going to remain white. Because if you remember, watercolour, the way to get white is the paper. You don't add white paint to watercolour. Some of the masts I do use a white gel pen, but that is only for very fine things. So here I am masking out the lines, and I've drawn in that little boat, that one on the right, and I'm actually going to add some more masking fluid to that because I want the whole of that little boat masked out, so the Frisk masking fluid is better for that. It takes quite a long while to dry. Here I am changing the masking tape for one that is a higher tack, and I actually ran out, so I had to use a little bit of this blue one. And the blue one is really good in the fact that it's a really good tack. It sticks really well, but not too much, so it doesn't pull your paper apart. But I do find that the dye comes out of the blue. Okay, so now I am just putting a wash of water onto the sky, and then I will add some colour to it. So you just want it nice and wet. It's going to be a wet into wet wash, and you want clean water obviously, and a clean brush. I have been guilty of not washing my brushes after I've finished and then using them for a wash and finding that I have got some of my old paint on it, but not this time. So for the sky, I'm going to use a cerulean blue and a yellow ochre. And a tiny bit of alizarin crimson a bit later on. So I'll start off at the top using the cerulean blue, which is always one of my favourite colours for sky. The sky will always be darker at the top of your picture and becomes paler as you go down towards the horizon, and with this late afternoon winter sun it will also become more golden as you go towards the horizon, hence using the yellow ochre, and that kind of makes the sun shine. But there is a little bit of cloud just near the horizon, which is what I will be using the alizarin crimson for. I've mixed the alizarin crimson with some of the cerulean to make it a more grey colour, but it does have this very, very faint pink tone to it, which you will be able to see more when I do the reflection in the water than it does in actual sky. And I will come back and put on more coats. So this is just the first layer, as I always tend to say. The sky won't have that many layers, it'll probably only have a couple. But the clouds I'll put in after the layers are dry. And I turn the paper just to let the water run up and down and the colours to just mix very subtly. I'm wiping off the water that's dripped down, just with a tissue. Just keep moving it. You have to be careful that once your paper starts to dry, it gets to that point where it's like blotting paper, and if you add anything to it, it will just make kind of those cauliflowers. So you have to really watch your paper and the shine of the water on it the whole time, and this is just something that comes with experience, really. And when the paper is cockled, that means it's kind of got a wavy texture to it. That means the paper is wet, so you need to wait until it's dry and straight again before you start putting other things in. If not, it will run into the thing that you've just done the wash on, which can spoil it. Sometimes you want that as an effect, but most times you don't. And you can dry it with a hairdryer. Sometimes I do that. It does move the paint around, so you have to be really careful, and sometimes it doesn't dry as evenly, so I don't always like to use it. Now I'm adding the cloudy bit just at the bottom and some more yellow here. And you might think, well, this is too pale, but skies in winter, they can be either really bright or they can be quite pale and subtle, and I always feel at this time of the late afternoon they're still a bit pale and subtle. Now I'm just wetting down the water in the creek, and this will be the same colours as in the sky but in the opposite order. So the bit nearest to you will be the blue, which is reflecting the top of the sky, and then the yellow golden bit will be in the middle with the alizarin crimson clouds nearer to the horizon. So if you always think that a reflection is an upside down sky, so the darker bit will always be closer to the viewer, whereas in the actual sky the darkest bit is at the top of the picture. And reflections, the water will reflect the sky darker than you see it in the actual sky itself, so the colours will be deeper. And this I come back to several times and give several layers, particularly the blue. You also, again, you want a very graduated wash so that things flow into each other. There's not a direct line where one colour finishes and the next one starts. And you do that by adding water, clear water, in between the two colours and letting them come together. And I think this is one of my favourite kind of responses in watercolour, is the way that colours fade together, and it's the smooth transition which we're aiming for. It's the water itself that enables this to happen. If your watercolour is too dry, then you won't achieve this effect. One thing with watercolour, there is a lot of time where you have to wait for it to dry. I will give several coats to this creek because I subtly want to make it darker, particularly the blue. So I will come back to that again and again. And even after it's dry, you can add, you don't wet the whole thing down again. You can add a little bit of wet wash, and then you just use some clear water to make the transition between that and the dry one come together so that it smooths it all out. The next thing I'm going to get on with is the hills in the background. And again, I'll be using yellow ochre added to some olive greens and sap green and some burnt sienna. In this part of the painting, one of the main things that you want to show is the transition between the sunny yellow ochre of the trees and the shadows, plus the atmospheric distance of the hills which are further away. And as it comes closer to you, so the colours will be darker. I actually worked on this painting for about 5 days, not continuously, but still several hours a day. It takes me a lot longer to do a finished painting than a sketch because I have to build up a lot more layers. A sketch normally takes me about 3 hours, continuous work. Whereas with a finished painting, I tend not to work continuously unless it's a really complicated subject. And oftentimes I'll even have several different paintings on the go at the same time. So everyone, I hope you've enjoyed watching the start of this painting and that you'll join me next time to see the painting's completion. Please subscribe and hit the bell symbol so that you don't miss the second half. Stay safe, stay well, till next time. Happy painting. Bye!